Good morning. Today we're going to take a little time to discuss one of the properties that CSS3 has introduced that should allow us to control the number of columns that we're using in our current page layouts. For years we struggled with laying out how we would like to have the text displayed. In the early years of the web, everything just seemed to be one page worth of information with text, scrolling across the entire page. Of course, back in those days, we didn't have monitors with the type of resolution that we have today. When I first started designing sites, the average screen resolution was 640 by 480, and we were dealing with 14-inch CRTs. Well, that's a long time ago as far as screen resolution goes today, and those settings are all over the map because we have screen resolutions that seem to be all over the map, anywhere from 1024 by 768 all the way up, actually exceeding 1920 as far as width goes, all the way up to 2500, 3200 pixels as far as the screen width goes. So it's broad as far as what we're attempting to do today in accommodating all those different types of resolutions. That's in standard desktop scenarios, but that still doesn't take into consideration the number of mobile devices that we're working with today as well. So one of the ways that we can combat that and still make the text that we are providing, the content specifically that we're providing, easier to make use of or to read, is to divide up the text into easier to read blocks of content. There has been for a number of years a golden ratio to take into consideration when it comes to the number of characters that we should have per line, and that golden ratio is the font size in regard to line height, which is 1 to a 1.618 ratio, and that isn't always that is the golden rule, but it isn't always perfect when it comes to how we lay things out, because the other thing we need to take into consideration not only is the proportion between the font itself and the line height, but we also need to take into consideration the width of the amount of text that we're dealing with, hence the concept of needing multiple columns. I have, for the purposes of what we're demonstrating today, borrowed from the Gutenberg project the very first chapter of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and you'll see that first chapter here being displayed in our browser window. My current screen resolution is set to about 1440 as far as width goes, and you'll notice that in reading this, granted I need to take some margins into consideration. We'll fix that in just a moment, but initially, the first thing that you'll notice is that especially when you get into paragraphs of any particular length, like the second to the last paragraph in this very first chapter, it might be difficult once you're in the middle of the paragraph to be able to figure out what line you just finished and where the beginning of the next line is. And that's because the lines are significantly wider and we have way too many characters to take into consideration. So in the past we used tables to divide the page up, and after tables kind of fell out of favor when CSS was being implemented correctly, or being implemented across the board in our browser of choice, or the browsers that we wanted our clients to be able to use, then we started making use of div tags and dividing the page up into sections, and we made use of either absolute positioning for those div tags, or we made use of floats to say, well, column B is going to float next to column A, and if I wanted 3 columns, then I could have a third or a fourth or a fifth column as far as my layout goes. Well, what CSS3 has introduced to us is the concept of a multi-column layout capabilities. So we now have the ability to say, I have this huge block of text, and it's going to go in a particular container, and I'd like to specify how many columns will automatically be made use of. And I can do that by giving it a column count if I want to, or I can even get more specific and say that I want the column to be of a particular width. I'm using brackets here as far as displaying my code, and of course it's just laid out here in a standard section attribute for HTML5. So this, on a per chapter basis, I would put each chapter in an individual section. I've also placed the two headings that I have on the page inside this section as well, and I've linked to an external style sheet, and that's where the modifications that we have made and will make will be applied. As a matter of fact, if I go over here to my style sheet, you'll notice that one of the first things I've done is I've actually placed a small CSS reset at the top of this particular file. This was one that I borrowed from Vladimir Carr, and I'm kind of the opinion that a reset is a good idea, but the reset should be minimal as far as what we're attempting to do. So in this particular case, you notice that we've removed the margin and paddings from some of our major block level elements. We've also removed the border and collapsed the border for tables and set the alignment slightly differently to the table content. Of course, the text being aligned to the left is normal, but the vertical alignment being set to top pardon me, is slightly different than we would normally use. Middle is the normal alignment position. Also, I've just set all of the headings and TH tags and captioning and table data information to set their font weight to normal, and established no borders for any images, although in this particular case there are none. And again, like I said, there are a huge variety of resets that are available, all the way from Eric Myers to the implementation that we're using today. The next thing I opted to do, and these are all commented out, and we'll kind of put these back in place as we go, is decided that I would like my H1 and H2 tags to be a slightly different font than the default text in a web page. Most browsers today are still using Times or Times New Roman, which is what we're using as far as a serif font for the majority of the text, but I'd like our headings to be a sans serif font. And if I uncomment this, and actually if I uncomment this, there we go, then that should allow me to expand this here, and you can see that I've chosen Tahoma as my first choice. If that's not available, Arial, or otherwise we'll just default to a sans serif font. And with that accomplished, if I come back over here and take a look at the page and scroll back up, of course my headings are in place. They are bold as far as text, as far as the weight of the font goes, or actually I should say they're normal because of the reset that we have in place, but the size is in place. And then the next thing I've chosen to do is to resize each of those. So again, if I uncomment this, you can see that my H1 tag will be 1.2 ems, and my H2 tag here will be 0.9 ems, as well as being italic as far as the style goes. So with those changes in place, if I come back over here, you'll notice that the sizing has taken place. My H2 tag now also has been set to slightly smaller than what the normal font would be, as well as being italicized. So now we can come down and take a look at some of the options that are available if in fact we choose to make use of this multi-column concept. And the CSS multi-column properties that are available, I think I mentioned earlier that we could base this on one of two things when it comes to the number of columns. We could either establish a column count, so I could say I want column count :2 or column count :3 or 4 or 5, depending on how many columns I actually want to make use of. Or, as I've chosen to do when it comes to this particular layout, I'm going to make use of the column width. And with column width, then you can establish how wide you want your columns to be. And then depending on what the screen resolution is and how much text it is, it will automatically generate the appropriate number of columns. So if you set the column width to 450 pixels or to 600 pixels, or as in our case, what I've chosen to do is actually set it based on our default unit of measurement, which is going to be ems. Then in our case, we're going to set it to 33 ems. Part of the reason I've chosen to do that is with the font that we're using, and with 33 ems being selected, that is kind of optimizing the number of characters per line. So not only are we going to get the appropriate ratio that we'll establish also in our section styles to establish the line height compared to the font size, but we're also going to establish the appropriate number of characters per line in a multi-column layout. And that generally falls in the, and it's going to vary depending on who you ask, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 75 characters. Some people will say 70 to 90 characters per line. Characters also including any punctuation and space between the individual words. At about 33 ems, that's going to be in that roughly 60 to 75 characters per line. And what you're attempting to do is not make the lines so narrow that the issue that you run into is that people are reading so fast they're skipping content, nor do you want the lines to be so wide that, again, they're having difficulty finding out where the beginning of the next line starts compared to where the end of the previous line left off. So 33 ems in our case seems to be that optimal length that we're going to end up dealing with. The other thing you can also do is establish the amount of space between the columns. So column gap allows you to establish the spacing, whether it be in pixels or whatever unit of measurement you're choosing to be between your individual columns. And then on top of that, you can also establish a line if you chose to do so. So you have a rule, a column rule that you're going to set the style, the width, and the color. So if you chose to have a gray line between them, you could establish that by making use of the column rule. Column span also allows you to establish, like in the case of my headings, if I wanted the headings to span multiple columns, then I could set the column span to 2 for my headings, and that would allow the heading to lay across both columns as opposed to just being at the top of the first column. So without any of those in place, at this particular point, I'm going to expand my section rule down here, and I will uncomment this. As a matter of fact, what I think I'll do is what I'll do is just go ahead and uncomment this. And you can see that what we've established here is I'm going to set a 2em margin for the section, which means I'll have 2 ems top, bottom, left, and right. We're just going to leave the font size set at its default to 1em, but I have set the line height to 1.44 ems. That's kind of a compromise between the golden ratio, that 1.618 that I was talking about, but also taking into consideration that the majority of what you're seeing in a font isn't the overall height, which is the height of the capital letter, but it's actually the X height, which is the size of the lowercase letters. So 1.44 seems to be optimized. Then we'll get into establishing the actual column width. As I said, we're going to establish that at 33 ems, which should give us roughly 60 to 75 characters per line. Now, one of the issues that you'll run into is the fact that you still need the appropriate browser prefix in place in order for these multi-column properties to work. So I have the Mozilla and WebKit prefixes in place, which should handle everything for Mozilla and for WebKit, as well as the last line here, establishing, of course, just the generic or standard W3C syntax that will eventually be used by all browsers. As a matter of fact, just to let you know what browsers work in this particular arena, if we come over here to caniuse.com and type in column width up here at the very top, you'll notice that Internet Explorer 8 and 9, it didn't work in either of those browsers, but in 11, which is what most people are using today, for those people still using Internet Explorer, it works perfectly fine in IE 11. It also works in the Windows 10 arena for Edge. You'll notice that support is partial for the other major browsers, and that's all with the caveat of partial support as long as it includes the prefix. All right. So Firefox and Chrome have that in place. You'll also notice that there's partial support over here for Safari and Opera, as well as the iOS version of Safari and the Android version of Safari. Again, as long as we make use of those browser prefixes, then we shouldn't have too many issues. All right. So that's why we've got everything prefixed here. I've also chosen to supply a unit of measurement for the column gap, and it's going to be the same scenario. So in this case, we have to make use of the Mozilla and WebKit prefix in order for column gap to work. I've set it to 1.5 ems. Everything that I'm using from a unit of measurement perspective is all being done as relative units of measurement. All right. So if I save this and then come back over to Chrome to take a look at what is in place now, you'll notice that my margins are in place all the way around. As a matter of fact, initially on refreshing, Chrome through brackets is automatically going to put this blue box around this. This is indicating that this is the most recent save and change that I've made. All right, but my headings are in place. I've got a 2-column layout. I've got a 1.5 em gap between the 2 columns. And as a matter of fact, if I do attempt to resize this and reduce the size of the page, once I get down to a particular size here, you'll notice it shifts from a 2-column layout to a single column layout. Once it realizes that line width has reduced to the point where that 33 ems is taken into consideration. But from a line width perspective, these should be just long enough for us to read comfortably and also read with some semblance of speed without feeling like we get lost in the process. And that was simply by establishing a column width, or we could have just come in and said, you know what, I just would rather establish a column count, and I'd rather have 2 columns or I'd rather have 3 columns. Either way you look at it, CSS3 has in essence come to the rescue for us when it comes to multi-column layouts, making it much easier than us having to build tables like we did long ago and far away, or worried about how things are going to work when we have 2 columns floating next to each other.